Nick Molden, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for inviting me.
So tell us about Dieselgate. That's a word I've actually never heard before.
Dieselgate is the biggest vehicle emissions scandal in a generation, if not longer. It all originated in the United States, actually, but became a much bigger scandal over here in Europe. Essentially, all the vehicles on the road have to meet certain emissions limits. So you can't have more than a certain amount of carbon monoxide or whatever the gas is under the law. Each vehicle has to be certified as below a certain level. And there's an official test. And just like at school, if you cheat the test, if you hide a book in your coat or have some notes under the desk and you get found out, then your car is illegal, you get fined. And that's essentially what happened. So it was triggered in September 2015 in California against Volkswagen. Volkswagen were found to be cheating their nitrogen oxide emissions. Now that sounds very technical. Nitrogen oxides, though, are an air pollutant, one of the biggest air pollutants, and they cause respiratory problems for people, especially in cities. So high concentrations of NOx in cities lead to asthma and worse. So very undesirable. But it's expensive to clean this mess up at the tailpipe. So if you can wiggle through the rules in a way to save cost, but still be technically compliant, then many manufacturers try that. VW pushed it too far, crossed the line, and were found out. But then the interesting twist in the tale was that almost every manufacturer in Europe was doing the same thing. So one manufacturer was doing it in the US, led everyone to ask the question, hey, who's doing it? Is the same thing happening in Europe? And we find out that actually everyone pretty much was doing it, except that the European regulations had been written in a slightly vague way. So at the moment, there's a whole bunch of lawsuits going through the courts of European countries trying to determine whether or not the activity in Europe was actually against the law. It was clear cut in the United States. VW were paid upwards of $40 billion in fines and reparations. So far in Europe, it's been next to nothing in comparison because black and white in US, gray area in Europe. And sitting in America, most people think Dieselgate is a chapter closed, we've moved on. And that's true in the US, but in Europe, it is a still living, breathing thing, which has got years to run before the true story is known. So it's a transatlantic scandal, if you like, but we are still living with it in Europe and will do for years to come.
Very interesting. Well, that was a great description of that. And I see your company behind you there, I wanted to point out, is Emissions Analytics. So can you tell us what the company does, how it relates to Dieselgate in any way in terms of, can it help prevent future Dieselgate from happening? Can it make the emissions more honest and transparent? What does Emissions Analytics do?
Yeah. Well, in the question, you hit the nail right on the head. That's exactly what we are trying to do, is to stop another Dieselgate happening. What we are trying to do is make vehicles consistent with a healthy planet, healthy air. We're very much pro mobility. Our society is built upon vehicles, on energy, transportation. And we're not trying to take the world back to a age before the motor vehicle, so everyone has to walk and cycle unless they want to. We have to make mobility consistent with a quality environment. And the problem is that many of the certification schemes including for nitrogen oxide emissions, don't necessarily align with the real world. They give false reassurance. Everyone thinks if a vehicle has this wonderful Euro 6 label over here in Europe or Tier 3 in the US, that it's therefore can be completely trusted and it's all clean. Well, actually, we found out in many cases that is not the case, and we're trying to shine a light on that. And in fact, um, we were shouting about Dieselgate 2 years before it happened, that we were publishing data through my association with Imperial College in London, showing that nitrogen oxide emissions were well above regulated levels. But it was very interesting. There was a great inertia amongst regulators and the industry to do anything about it. Because essentially, anything you have to do to reduce emissions tends to cost you money as the industry. So the more you can put that off, dilute it, delay it, confuse it, the better. But the industry would have been a lot better off had it embraced the problems at the time before it became a scandal. They let it become a scandal. And what's happened as a result is essentially the internal combustion engine is being banned in a lot of countries in the next few years. So it's now forcing manufacturers to invest tens of billions of dollars re-engineering their business. When had they cleaned up the internal combustion engine in the first place, that pressure wouldn't have been anything like as great. So there is a value. It is not just us as environmental hawks trying to point where there are problems. It's positively a benefit to the industry that they know what they're really doing. So they have an opportunity to clean up. They can see what best practice is. If one of their competitors has a great new technology for cleaning things up, that's the way we can all collectively drive to a better solution. This isn't an anti-industry company at all. It is trying to make the industry work so we can have clean, green transportation.
And no, that sounds good. And absolutely, industry is hugely important to our thriving and flourishing. So, quick question around that. Do you guys use any sort of special technology? Do you employ technology from other companies? How do you go about actually doing your testing?
It's a combination. So the core system we use is brought in from a Michigan-based company called Sensors. It's called a Portable Emissions Measurement System, PEMS. And that's the sort of bedrock of it. And it's essentially a big box. It's like you take a whole laboratory and stuff it in a box, put it in the car, and you connect it onto the tailpipe. And it essentially sniffs what comes out of the exhaust pipe very accurately and very rapidly, but it is nevertheless sniffing tailpipes. That is a piece of equipment which is actually also used in official certification. But we've added on top of that. So we've developed an additional system which samples for other things as well. So we can take gases onto little sample tubes and capture gas in those tubes and then take it to our laboratory back near Oxford in the UK or in Los Angeles in the US and do a much deeper dive. We can put it through something called a two-dimensional gas chromatography system, which is allied with mass spectrometry, which can then effectively tell you every single organic compound in that tube. Now, why does that matter? Because there are lots of unregulated compounds, formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, benzene, toluene. I could give you hundreds of examples of compounds that come out of the tailpipe in relatively low concentrations. But when you add it up across all the cars on the road, that can add up to levels that lead to cancers in humans, organ damage, respiratory problems. Not all the time. Obviously, we're not dropping dead left, right, and center, but you get pollution hotspots. And where people are chronically exposed to that, you're building up a health problem that you can see in hospital admissions often. So it is real, but we, for the first time, I think, have been able to develop a technique which allows us to say everything that's in that tube. We're not just looking for a few things. We can say, whatever in that tube, tell me what it is. And that's what we grafted on top. That's our intellectual property, which sits on top of these basic PEMS units from sensors.
Well, I think you've stumbled onto something very important here, and maybe not stumbled onto it. Maybe you did it intentionally, but a lot of the focus is around CO2 and climate change. However, this is a distant problem that may be off into the future. I noticed that a lot of the things that come out of these tailpipes are immediately damaging to humans. And if you can correlate that to hospital records, then I would say that makes a huge difference in terms of getting the public on board for wanting to transition to, say, EVs or other types of transportation.
Yeah, that's right. And there's one important difference between CO2 and all the other pollutants is that all the other pollutants can be cleaned up to a large extent on board before they ever get emitted. If you stick the right clever after treatment system, I guess in common terms, we would call them catalytic converters, although that strictly only does certain ones of them. But you bung clever bit of technology in the tailpipe and that can clean up most of the pollutants with the exception of CO2. So there is no way that I'm aware of that can significantly clean up CO2 at the tailpipe. The reason being, there's just too much of it. There's too much of it, and CO2 is too unreactive a gas to be able to do it. I mean, we're talking, typically out of the American vehicle, something like 300 grams per every mile driven. So almost a pound by weight of CO2 per mile driven. So that gives you an idea. There's a huge amount of CO2. That's why it's difficult to clean up. And that's why the solution to that is upstream. So either change the fuel or more dramatically, change the powertrain completely, switch to hybrid or electric. We haven't got a downstream solution. I guess the ultimate downstream solution is scrubbing the CO2 out of the air once it's already been emitted. But there's nothing you can really do on vehicle in real time to scrub that CO2. It's primarily an upstream solution. And that's why we are, moving to electrification, because that is seen to be the most effective way. But the point, and to your question, is that electrification is not required to clean up the air pollutants. Both can be cleaned up at the tailpipe. It's the CO2 which is the really stubborn one.
Sure, and that's why we're always saying and not or. You have to do everything to make a difference. So another
Well,
question.
not if you're in Europe, if I may interrupt. If you're in Europe, and particularly in the UK, we're saying, no, actually, we're not doing a multitude of solutions. It's got to be battery electric, not even plug-in hybrids. It's got to be battery electric by 2035. We know the perfect solution. Everyone's got to go to that, irrespective of cost and efficacy. The United States approach and other countries' approach, which is a much more diverse, this is a big problem. We need to use a whole range of approaches to solve it. That is a much more sensible, much lower risk, much lower cost approach. But so sorry to interrupt you, but that I think is a really important point to get out there is that just going for a single-minded ban on internal combustion engines and going to EVs may sound like a lovely, simple, wholesome answer. The problem with it is it'll be expensive and it won't be deliverable. You need a mixed solution. Even some internal combustion engines could fall part of a world in which we actually solve climate change.
Absolutely. You sound a little bit like me, Nick. I call myself a radical moderate, right? Is you have to have multiple solutions. So on the plan in the UK to ban EVs, we have a similar plan in California, much to our chagrin. I'm sitting here in Florida. We're getting new movers from California daily. let's say, to we like to call it the free state of Florida. But to the point of emissions, so you're currently testing emissions on internal combustion engines. Once it goes to EVs, doesn't it become important to test the carbon footprint upstream that went into actually manufacturing that EV?
For sure. But there's also an in-use emissions as well, which I will come to with EVs too. It's not as if EVs are zero emissions in operation either. But to the first point about the construction emissions, that's true. It does not lend itself to our type of testing. What's characteristic about our type of testing is you're testing a vehicle in motion, and often where you're emitting low concentrations in a highly dynamic environment. So you need high response, high accuracy equipment, but that you can instrument on a vehicle. If you're looking at the construction emissions, whether it's an ICE or whether it's a battery electric vehicle, it doesn't. You're not in a same dynamic situation. What you're talking about is mines, processing plants, factories, oil refineries. Now, these are big, non-dynamic, fixed installations. And in a sense, from a scientific point of view, those emissions are much easier to measure. They're in a fixed place and there's a lot of it. And we can do that. And it can often be done relatively easily by looking at the sort of mass of material that goes in and out of these factories. The difficulty is the confidentiality, or that these installations are not forced to disclose necessarily all the information necessary to evaluate their emissions. So when people talk about these life cycle models of cradle to grave emissions, the big challenge around the upstream manufacturing emissions is not so much creating a clever model. It is making sure you're feeding into your model information that's accurate. How can you validate it? So if you're talking, I don't know, a refinery of Saudi Aramco, how do you validate that emissions without, would they give you the necessary information? If you're looking at a mine in the Congo, or if you're looking at a battery refining plant in China, how do you get hold of that data and validate it? So that's the big challenge around that. The in-use emissions with electric vehicles is primarily for tires. Now, tires is the greatest environmental problem you've never heard of, although it is rapidly moving up the agenda. Key thing though is there's about 6 million tons of tire material that are released from tires, not end-of-life tires, just the abrasion, the invisible part. 6 million tons a year worldwide. That's a lot. And the tires are largely made of crude oil as well. So, the irony that we're moving away from internal combustion engine burning crude oil to now a concern about tires abrading effectively rubber based on crude oil, synthetic rubber. And why is that a particular problem with EVs? Because after all vehicles have tires. The EVs on average are about 40% heavier. And basically about pound for pound, for every additional ton of weight of the vehicle, you get the same percentage increase in the tire emissions. So heavier vehicles are bad for tire emissions. Now, not every electric vehicle is super heavy, but on average, they are significantly heavier. So what you've got by shifting to EVs, you're moving the emissions upstream to the battery fabrication and downstream to more tire emissions. Now, overall, just before I have the battery lobby jump all over me, our testing shows that a typical electric vehicle reduces the CO2 over its whole life by about 50% compared to an equivalent combustion engine. So it is still a significant reduction. But there's two caveats to that. One is that's a lot less than the zero emissions promise that we've been given, point one. And secondly, there is a huge variability. Actually, in California, it is probably greater than 50%. In Poland, it will be probably near zero benefit. So electric vehicles work really well in certain circumstances, but they are not they're not the only solution. They should be part of a mixed solution. And probably Los Angeles is almost the perfect place for electric vehicles because not only is the grid relatively clean, but also you're talking about because the congestion is so high, you've got short distances and long journey times. And EVs love that. EVs are great in traffic. What EVs are bad at is long distances at high speed, and particularly in colder places as well. So for a global solution, battery electric vehicles aren't everything, but they are nevertheless a really important part of the solution.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Nick, tell me about what your plans are for the future with emissions analytics. Are you going to continue to develop, test other types of emissions, or where are you guys headed?
Yeah, well, anything to do with vehicles and how they emit is within our scope. And that suddenly brings in all sorts of areas. So if you think about it, even the plastics from the trim of the vehicle, actually, they emit volatile organic compounds off. Now, that doesn't tend to be a problem in the open air. Then if you think about the plastics inside the cabin, which is a confined space, as the cabin gets warmer, these gases emit off the plastics, off the dashboard, off the leathers, off the carpet, etc. So vehicle interior air quality is an area of significant concern for us, particularly for hot climates. Together with that, through the ventilation system, these tiny little particulates from tailpipe, from tires, from fields where it's blown in, get in via the ventilation system. And once trapped inside the vehicle, you as the driver are sat there inhaling this combination of particles and these volatile organics. And the cabin is a bit of a chemical soup in which you might sit for 2-3 hours, sort of mulling in this soup. So we're working a lot to try and establish test methodologies, potentially even regulatory limits about the exposures of drivers and passengers to those chemicals inside the vehicle. So in a sense, we're doing this very deep dive on tailpipes. Combustion engines are not going to be going away anytime soon, particularly if you think heavy duty and construction. And then there's the tire emissions from virtually every vehicle. And then there's the vehicle interior air quality from virtually every vehicle. And actually, I don't know if I'm allowed to promote it, but we're running 2 conferences on tire wear emissions next year. We're new conferences that launch to the market, one of which is in California, to try and bring together all the parties, academia, industry, and authorities to try and crack these problems. So we're not just doing testing ourselves. We realize we're one small player in a big area, but what we can do is bring together people and stimulate that with real world data and try and, accelerate our journey towards solutions to these problems.
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense to get people together. You certainly can plug your conference. We're planning a conference next year as well. So it'd be hypocritical if I didn't let you plug it. That's going to be in California next year.
April 24th to 5th in Irvine, Southern California.
Very good. Well, Nick, this has been awesome.
On the website.
Tell the audience how they can get in touch with you and your website so that way they can reach out and maybe attend the conference.
Yeah, absolutely. So emissionsanalytics.com and all the conferences are in the events section. So yeah, please do get in touch and our contact details are all there. If you want to speak to me personally, I'm on LinkedIn, Nick Molden. I've also launched a group within LinkedIn called the Tire Emissions Research Consortium. So any tire researchers out there, please do come and join that too. So I'm very easy to track down. I'm always delighted to talk to anyone who wants to be either part of this mission or where people can, need help in testing or data acquisition using our techniques.
Very good. Nick, thank you for being on Energy Superheroes. This has been Nick Molden with Emissions Analytics. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you.